Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to start writing some tests for our React application. It's going to take some time, so I'll likely split it up into two parts. And I also need a drink, so I have my apple juice here with me. We'll be using enzyme and jest for our tests. Now, you don't need to add jest because Create React App kind of comes pre-packaged with it. You do need to add enzyme though. And you also need to create a file called setup tests inside the source folder, setup tests.js. Copy that. And as you can probably guess from its name, it's used to set up the test environment with enzyme. And before we actually write our own test, let's have it running. Where are we? Excuse me. There we go. Let's start writing running our tests, because I do believe there is one already. There we go. You can press A to run all tests, and it's going to pass. Now, when I first saw this, when I was trying to teach myself React for the first time, and I was looking into testing, it didn't make much sense, or more so, I didn't know what to do afterwards, because if you take a look at this test, all it's trying to do is create a DOM element and try to render that through React DOM. There's not even a single assertion. There's no explicit tests being written here. All it really is doing is tries to render something, and as long as there's no exception being thrown or like an error being thrown, it passes. And so, cool. So we just tested that it renders, but now what? Right? So it was quite challenging for me to really learn how to test React application. And I think that sentiment is somewhat shared, because seemingly, at least for me, it seems that there is less consensus around best practices when it comes to front-end testing and React testing. So by no means am I saying that the tests that I'm going to be writing right now are best practices. It's just things that I know how to write and I know that I found useful for myself. However, if you know any better tests to write, please let me know. I would be very, very curious. Having that said, let's actually start writing our own tests. Now I'm going to go to pages, and the easiest, the simplest component that we have is home. So let's write a test for that first. Home.test.js. And as soon as I create this file, it's probably going to run again and fail, because essentially what Jest does is it listens for any JavaScript files that has test inside of it. And by creating home.test.js, it's saying, oh, there's another test, but there's nothing inside of it, so it fails. Okay. Now, when you're thinking about what kind of tests to write, what I like to do is first think about, especially for components, what I like to do is think about what is the main responsibility of this component? What should this component be concerned with? And there could be code inside that component that when you're going through this thought exercise, that you might think, well, I don't know if I should actually test this part about this component. Then it's funny, because when you get there, actually that tells you that, well, maybe that chunk of code shouldn't be inside that component to begin with. Right? So it's actually a really good exercise to go through that. I actually find in one way or another, writing tests, the process of writing tests and thinking about what kind of tests to write is more helpful and useful than writing the tests and testing them itself. Right? Anyways, having that said, let's take a look at home. And what is home's main responsibility and main concern? Right? For me, it seems like at this point, of course, it's going to get a lot more complex later on. Right now, as it stands, all it's really doing is it's rendering a H1 with some text inside of it, specifically home, wrapped up in a layout, right? Now, the next question could be then, well, then should we write some tests about layout? I think not, because from home's perspective, it doesn't really care what layout is and what layout is doing. And in fact, it could literally be just a div, and there would be no difference, at least for home, right? So we don't need to test anything about layout. All I can think of right now for home is to test whether or not it renders an H1 with the text home. Right, so that's what we're going to do. And I think I have already written it out here. Okay, let's grab a hold of that, paste it. I'll save it. It should probably pass. There you go. But let's read through the code. So we're importing React and we're importing shallow from enzyme. What is shallow from enzyme, right? Enzyme.js. It would actually, in fact, be a good idea to have this documentation open while going through this video. Shallow rendering right here. Shallow rendering is useful to constrain yourself to testing a component as a unit and to ensure that your tests aren't indirectly asserting on behavior of child components. The way that I would kind of translate that is use shallow when you want to test your component in isolation as much as possible. Right? You're trying to test your component independent from its parents nor its children and its children. So you're trying to test this in a vacuum as much as possible. Right? In our case, home, it's not doing much. There's nothing, it's not connected to like some kind of state or anything like that. We definitely want to test this in isolation as much as possible, like almost like a unit test in a way. So we're going to use shallow, right? What that would do is it'll basically shallow render, create a render of the component that you pass in. Now, maybe I shouldn't say render because it's not actually rendering it on any kind of DOM or anything like that, but it is creating a JavaScript object representation of that, right? So what we're doing is we're shallow rendering home. We're assigning it to wrapper, and inside wrapper we have a method called find, and you can probably find it right here. There we go. Find selector, right? We're finding an H1 inside of it, and then we are grabbing all of its HTML components, actually parsing it into an HTML string, and then saying, okay, inside that the string should contain home because it does. So a few things about this, right? So you will see a lot of selectors being used throughout when you're using enzyme to test. The enzyme selector, you can use any kind of valid CSS selector. So think of jQuery selectors, right? So class syntax, ID syntax, element tag name, all works. But interestingly, you can also use a React component constructor itself. So, and we'll see this in action very soon. Okay, what else? You can also try to read about .html. Let's see here. Yep, there we go. Now, why am I using that? Let me actually show you. Console.log, and let's console log what this is. What you'll see here is that it's a shallow wrapper, right? So again, when you use shallow, it creates a JavaScript object that represents what the rendering of that component would be or should be. Now, inside this object, somewhere in there, probably will be some information about the fact that it's an H1, and the text home should be in there somewhere as well, but it's just hard to get there. The easiest way to get the actual representation of HTML or an HTML string is to just do .html on it. If I do that, there you go. That's the text that it returns. As you can see, it's pretty much what you would expect, right? And I can actually show you this test failing. So I changed the uppercase H to a lowercase. Now it fails because, well, look at this. Now it's lowercase, and the expected string was expected to contain value this, but it doesn't, right? Let's go back here. Test should pass now. Cool. afterwards, let's test our layout, because we were looking at, or I was talking about whether or not we should test layout inside our home tests, and I made some arguments as to why we probably wouldn't. And also, another reason is that we can test layout on its own. So we're going to go over here, create another file called layout.test.js. Now, again, when you're trying to think about tests to write, it's a good exercise to think about, okay, so what is this responsible for? Right, if you take a look at layout, what's its main concerns, right? It renders a few things, of course. Pretty much all React components do some kind of rendering. It renders a navbar, and it also renders children inside of another container of sorts. And the navbar has a few things happening in here as well. So at this point, I would think to myself, okay, so does that mean that I should be testing kind of navigation logic inside my layout component? And you can go either way, but I would say for myself at the very least, probably not. That also gives me a hint that, oh, if that's the case, then maybe I should actually extract the navbar related elements out into a separate component, right? So maybe it's a good idea right now to do that. What I'm going to do here is then, okay, create another component here that says navbar.js, right? And I'm going to import React from React. And where do I need anything? I will probably need all of this actually. Let's do that. And export default function navbar return, right? And I'm gonna grab a hold of this right here, paste it inside there. We need these guys, so we're gonna go over here, say, all right, grab a hold of all of that, paste it right here, right? It's not using link. It is using link. Ooh, that's odd. Why is it still grayed out? It could be that it's just being slow. Here though, now that we've grabbed all of that, we can remove this and simply say navbar. And we need to import navbar. Oh, I think I haven't changed the name. Oh, I have. Export default navbar. Okay. Import navbar from navbar, so that works. I think some of VS Code's add-ons aren't working. That's fine. And oh, this is also an interesting thought too. We are wrapping layout with router, but in fact, we only need that because navbar has some functionalities and features that relates to navigation, right? But if we're extracting that out of layout and putting it in navbar, we actually don't have to wrap layout with router. So we're going to do this instead. Remove that and grab a hold of that. Oh, there we are. And we can say export default navbar. Save that, and we remove that, save that. I think we're good. Looks good. Looks pretty good. Yeah, it's just being slow. Okay. All right. Now, from here, we can start writing our test, and let's go back to thinking about like what the main responsibility of layout is. Now that we have kind of hidden the navigation related features and logic from layout, it's all in the component navbar. It's no longer in layout. So now that you take a look at it, you'll notice the fact that, oh, navbar needs to have location. Again, this is coming from with router, okay? While layout no longer needs location. As I was saying, now that we have done that, extracting navigation away from layout, it got pretty clear that the component layout doesn't care much about anything else other than the fact that it's rendering two things, two children, the navbar and its children inside a styled main. So that's the only thing that we should be testing for. So we go to layout.test.js, go over here, grab a hold of that, paste it. Cool. So let's read through this. We're using shallow again, and we're grabbing layout and navbar, and we're saying it renders navbar and main. Now, why do we need navbar here while we're testing for layout? And we'll see. First, we're going to shallow render layout, and then say, okay, layout's children should be too many, right? And that is true. There's navbar and there's styled main. And it should also have navbar. I was saying before how enzyme selectors, any kind of CSS selector will work. So I could have easily done something like this, going with like an tag name, because I believe it is a nav. Yep. So this should work too, but I want to be more explicit in places where I can be more explicit. So I'm importing navbar, the constructor for components, and I can use that as an enzyme selector, and it will work. Now here, and then it says wrapper.exist, and then I'm actually now using a CSS selector. So the question could be, well, why are you using a component here and using a CSS selector here? If your argument for using navbar here was that it's more explicit, then you should do the same thing. True and fair. However, for me to be able to do that, I would need to go over here and say, okay, so navbar, since it is a separate component of its own, I can import it here and then use it like so. But the second child, which is styled main, is not my own component that I'm exporting, that I can import. Well, that's easy to fix, right? I can simply say export styled main, and it should work. And it would work if I were to do so like this. I can, in fact, do styled main and do that instead. This should work. And in fact, just to show you that it would, let's run it. There you go. All passed. Let's get rid of this console log. Right, all of it passed, but in order for me to do that, I actually had to export styled main, which it's a little icky for me. Styled main is a should not be, and it would not be, and it should not be used outside the context of the component layout. It's in a way, think of it like a private method. It's if you're familiar with partial renders, it's kind of like that, right? It's a child component that will only exist within its parent, which is layout, and nowhere else. So exporting it just doesn't feel good. So I'm going to not do that, but instead give this guy an ID and call it main. And inside our test, we can, now it's going to fail, right? Because you can't import that. I'm no longer exporting it. But now here I'm going to say, okay, let's do that. All right. Now this doesn't feel fantastic either because I'm using IDs. However, the way I kind of get away with that in my mind is to say if the team, or if it's a one person team, you towards your own self, make a contract, right? It's kind of like a written rule between the team members or you against you that you would only use IDs for tests and nothing else, right? If that kind of rule and understanding is established, then I think it's okay, because what that means is as you're writing and reading um, your teammates' code or your code from like weeks ago, you run across IDs in your component. At least by then, at that point, you know the fact that, oh, this ID is here just so that we can run tests and nothing else, right? I think as long as if you can make that assumption, then doing this is fine. Okay, so that's that. The next thing that I'm going to do, the next test that I'm going to write for layout is, well, it should render navbar and main, but we should also test whether or not it renders its children that gets passed in like this, right? So we're going to shallow render it, but in this case, instead of shallow rendering this without any children prop being passed, we are going to pass something in. And then we're going to say, okay, expect that to contain the same exact thing, which should be true. So we save that and let the test run again. Cool. Now let's write some tests for navbar. I'm going to close all of that. Navbar, open that up. Okay, let's create navbar.test.js. Okay, it's gonna complain again, right? Exercise time, once more. What is navbar's main feature, responsibility, its kind of core concerns? Well, it's rendering something called meeting stone. But what is this? This is supposed to be a logo, right? So right now it's just text, but later on it could be like some SVG or something like that, right? So let's just give this guy an ID of logo. So it should be rendering logo, and also it should be rendering some navigation items. So let's do something like that. We can change it. And inside there are styled links. Currently there are 2 navigation items, so we need to test if it renders 2 navigation items. And there's one more thing that's happening here. I do want to test the actual styling as well, because in our previous videos we made it so that the navigation items get styled slightly differently depending on the current path, right? That's what this thing was all about. So we should test for that as well, right? Cool. So we're going to save this here, and in our navbar tests, let's go down here, and we're going to grab all of that, and I'm going to go through the code. The first thing that you'll notice is that we're not using shallow, but rather we're using mount. Let's go to documentation, down here, full DOM rendering, mount. Right, full DOM rendering is ideal for use cases where you have components that may interact with DOM APIs or need to test components that are wrapped in higher order components. Navbar is wrapped in a higher order component with router, right? And not just that, so what that means is navbar, it does not function correctly. It cannot function without having it being wrapped in a higher order component, right? So it's dependent on its parents. It's dependent on something that is outside of it. So in those cases, it's hard to write tests using shallow. You will have to use mount. So that's what we're doing. So the first thing that we're testing for is that it renders a logo. So we're gonna mount, so render navbar, but like I was saying, so first of all, let's just save this and see it pass. Oh, what's wrong? Cannot find module.index from navbar. What does that mean? Oh, I'll change this later. Navbar. Let's do that. In fact, let's update our nodes right now. There you go. So all of it has passed, and if we don't wrap it with router, it's going to complain. You should not use route outside of a router, right? So navbar has, it doesn't have the route component, but it does have link. So essentially it's basically saying, hey, listen, we can't actually render navbar the way that you want us to render without it being wrapped inside a router component. So we just do that. And what we're going to say is, okay, so once we have mounted our components, within that, we're going to try to find logo, and it should have a length of 1, meaning that there should only be one that gets selected from that selector, which is true. There's only one. Now, if we say 2, which does not make sense, it should fail. There we go. So let's go back to 1. And we're going to say, okay, it should render navigation items too. So we do the same exact thing, and then we're going to try to find navigation items. Now, the result, the return value from this is going to be 1 node, because it is, right? It's the div that is wrapping the navigation items. So if we look for the div, we're going to get a result of 1 node, right? But we also want to test how many navigation items there are. So we have 2. So we're going to say wrapper dot or navigation items dot children, thereby grabbing these and say there are 2 nodes to have length 2. So that's why it runs and passes. So fantastic. I am going to stop here. In the next video, we're going to test navigation items having different styles depending on the current path. And we're also going to write some tests for our users page. All right, see you soon.